it seems to me that in the annual accounts the Post Office reported to Parliament, there was false or misleading information presented that did lead to the financial gain of you, Mr. Reid, as Chief Executive Officer, and some of your senior colleagues. You went through the process, presumably, of getting metrics against the KPIs for the bonus scheme, going through assurance of that data, getting external verification of that data, reporting it to the Remuneration Committee, discussing it at board level, getting sign-off from the government, then producing your annual accounts, having those checked and reporting them to Parliament. And through that whole process, you didn't know that there was false information in that underpinned your bonus payment. I really want to know whether the Post Office as a corporate body or any individual knew that the information that made it through to the awarding of bonus payments and presentation in the annual accounts was either misleading or false. And I just want to start because I think it will be important in the context of how the Post Office wrongly prosecuted victims over many years to just read out Section 17 of the Theft Act about false accounting, which reads that where a person dishonestly, with a view to gain for himself or another, conceals or falsifies any account or record or document required for accounting purposes, or in furnishing information, produces or makes use of any account, record or document which to his knowledge is or may be misleading or false, on conviction can be imprisoned for up to 7 years. And that where a company commits that offence with the consent or cooperation of the chief executive, manager or office holder, that both the individual and the company may be liable and prosecuted by the court. Now, this was the basis on which many sub-postmasters were prosecuted, and we are not a court, we're a committee of Parliament, but it seems to me that in the annual accounts the Post Office reported to Parliament, there was false or misleading information presented that did lead to the financial gain of you, Mr. Reid, as Chief Executive Officer, and some of your senior colleagues. The question I therefore want to know the answer to is who knew about that, and in knowing, was the Post Office or any individual acting dishonestly? Nick Reid, did you know that 25% of the bonus scheme that you presented to the board, it was your idea, I understand it, that 25% of your bonus was rated on getting approval from the statutory inquiry chairman, Sir Wyn Williams? I mean, you knew that, didn't you?
Well, first and foremost, let me apologise for the error and for the mistake that has been made in the with the sub-metric in our transformation incentive scheme. There were 17, not wrong, there were 19 metrics in total, and one of them we made the error of identifying that Sir Wyn would effectively authorise this metric.
Not would, but did. Presumably.
And I think it's important, just to provide a bit of context for this. Certainly when the scheme was established, which was part of the transformation of the Post Office, we wanted to emerge from COVID and transform the Post Office. We had an independent, non-statutory inquiry of 4 months duration, which was very much focused on making sure nothing like this could happen again. And it was in that context that we established the transformation incentive scheme, and it was for that purpose that we believed that we would be through the 4-month independent inquiry. Now, clearly, the independent inquiry became a statutory inquiry halfway through the scheme term, and the mistake was that we didn't go back and revisit that particular incentive, and that was an error, and I apologise unreservedly for that, and that was certainly something that we should have identified.
But at that point, you went through the process, presumably, of getting metrics against the KPIs for the bonus scheme, going through assurance of that data, getting external verification of that data, reporting it to the Remuneration Committee, discussing it at board level, getting sign-off from the government, then producing your annual accounts, having those checked and reporting them to Parliament. And through that whole process, you didn't know that there was false information in that underpinned your bonus payment.
We had both internal and external assurance, and obviously we provided information to the Remuneration Committee for them to make their decision. I don't make those decisions. I don't decide how and who determines what bonus scheme I get, or indeed what that payment is.
It was your recommendation, wasn't it, that this scheme was put in place?
Absolutely. I agree that in terms of the incentives themselves and in terms of the suggestions and the proposal for how we should motivate and incentivise the senior team. That's what I present to the Remuneration Committee, and of course the Remuneration Committee then determines and decides how the scheme should operate.
Many of the victims will be, I think, confused about why post office executives needed a bonus incentivization to just do their day job, for which you already get paid handsomely. Why on earth was this in the bonus scheme in the first place?
I think it's a very fair question, and firstly, I would say that there will be no inquiry incentives going forward. But when we look back 2 years ago, it was very important for me that we transformed the post office, and we had a range of very complex and difficult priorities to address, whether that's getting off Horizon, whether that's ensuring that we redress the past, whether that's dealing with compensation, whether that's making sure the recommendations of the Common Issues Judgment are put into place, addressing the issues with Royal Mail. There are a range of priorities, and it was very important from my perspective that rather than just be transparent and open with the independent inquiry, as was, I wanted people to go above and beyond. I know that we cannot move on as a post office until such time as we've addressed the issues of the past. And so there was a range of different incentives, as I just mentioned, there were 19 in total, to motivate and incentivise the senior team to go above and beyond.
I'm just saying, it's a comment, not a question, but executives shouldn't have needed to be incentivised to go above and beyond to rectify the mistakes of the post office from the Horizon scandal. Lisa Harrington, I want to come to you next because you're mentioned quite frequently in Ms. Burton's report, and I want to go back to my initial question. I really want to know whether the post office as a corporate body or any individual knew that the information that made it through to the awarding of bonus payments and presentation in the annual accounts was either misleading or false.
First of all, I'd also like to reiterate my personal apology, but apology on behalf of the Post Office. The Remuneration Committee debated long and hard each of the metrics. In the case of the inquiry metric, we actually used an external source, which was a HSF, a Herbert Smith Freehill report that had been presented to the board in January, to give us confidence that the inquiry was being supported. Of course, it was inappropriate to have an inquiry metric at that point, but there was a debate on whether or not actually the achievement had been reached or not.
In the annual accounts, 25% of the bonus scheme, a quarter of the bonus scheme, had its own box with the sub-metrics in, and in the top of the box, it says very clearly that for that whole 25% to be awarded, it needed the approval of Sir Win Williams and the statutory inquiry. Are you really telling me that that wasn't something that the Remuneration Committee understood was required for that to be awarded?
For one of the sub-metrics, we have stated the...
Ms Harrington is at the top of the whole box in the annual report. So there are a number of sub-metrics in relation to the statutory inquiry. That was for 25% of the bonus scheme. And at the top of that box, in relation to all of the sub-metrics, it said that it needed the sign-off of the statutory inquiry.
It was an absolute error to present it in that way. That was definitely
didn't
not
somebody
the intention.
know that that was a mistake, that that was false, that it could be misleading? Somebody must have known that.
Yes, somebody should have. There were many people who reviewed it, and it wasn't picked up as a specific issue, but I absolutely agree it should not have been presented in that way. The intention was to bring external scrutiny so that we weren't telling ourselves we were doing a good job, when in fact we needed somebody external to help us validate that.
I find it a very hard argument to understand. I mean, as I said originally, I was a lawyer in my past life. If you look at a set of requirements, you go through and you say this is the requirement that is required. It's the job of compliance, of assurance, of audit, to look at these things and to make sure that it is absolutely robust. And yet, you're telling me that nobody knew that this requirement had not been met.
Nobody picked up on the wording needing to be updated.
I think it's more than just the wording. Ms Harrington. Amanda Burton, can I just come to you? Actually, before I do, forgive me, Mr Cooper on the screen. You were in these meetings when this metric was being discussed, when the awarding of this bonus payment was made, and according to Amanda Burton's report, you asked the pertinent question, how would we know if senior executives had delivered against this metric? And how you would know, based on the reporting of your own bonus scheme, was that Sir Win Williams would have told you, but that was never true, was it?
No. And I too want to apologise. It's this should never have happened, and it's clear that errors were made, and I apologise for my part in those errors. So I think the starting point is that the paper that was presented to the Remuneration Committee was flawed. It should have said that the the metric had not been met, and it should have made clear that there was no letter from the inquiry that addressed the point in the form that was required to meet the metric. That was the starting point. But then I think from my perspective, the error that I regret is that I did not pick up that there was no letter. I should have asked the question. I think any of us on the Remuneration Committee could and should, in my view, have asked the question, do we have this letter or not? And I think had we asked that question, this would have been flushed out and it would have been fixed.
It's just remarkable, isn't it, that a Remuneration Committee, a board, your internal audit, financial risk, assurance teams, your senior leaders, your external advisors, your lawyers, this is just not picked up. And the interesting question for me, having read out the statutory definition of false accounting, the key word here is whether anybody was dishonest, because it is right that somebody did gain, a number of people gained, on the basis of false information that was in an accounting document. And the only word that hangs that we don't know the answer to is whether somebody knew that and then dishonestly allowed it to go ahead. That would meet this statutory definition of false accounting, which many sub-postmasters were prosecuted under. I mean, I suspect many of the victims of the scandal will be looking today and hearing your apologies and saying, well, they weren't allowed to apologise for something that turned out to not be their fault. What are the consequences for any of you? Nick Reed?
As I say, I do think it was a mistake. I don't think there was anything dishonest. I think the intent of the metric was appropriate in the sense that we wanted to mobilise people, incentivise people to do the right thing, to get us through the inquiry in the most appropriate way, as in above and beyond. The mistake was quite clear, and the errors were made. There were many people who oversaw this, and many people who missed it. And I really do think it is. It's very disappointing, and it's a clear error. But as I say, I don't think the intent was in any way malicious.
Okay, I'm conscious of my own time, so I just want to make a little bit of progress. And Amanda Burton, page 8 of your report, I mean, you say, quite frankly, it's difficult to understand why the inquiry submetric was not questioned by anyone and yet seen by so many people. But you then go on to say that having taken into account the discretion available to the Remuneration Committee, that it was probably okay. What does discretion mean, Amanda Burton?
Thank you. I'd also like to reinforce the apologies that have been made. I mean, clearly there was a mistake throughout the setting of this target and the meeting of it, so I also apologise. In terms of discretion, the Remuneration Committee did have discretion, as was set out in the terms of the scheme and also in the terms of the letter that was sent to DBT. And it's perfectly normal for remuneration committees and other committees to exercise discretion. Clearly, they have to look at all the facts. And it's very unfortunate that the discretion wasn't recorded properly. It was recorded for other parts of metrics, but not this particular one, which is extremely unfortunate, because I would expect when a remuneration committee is going through that thought process, they make sure it is properly documented so that people looking back can see why that decision was made.
You would expect, I mean, discretion is the freedom to decide what should be done in a particular situation, which implies knowledge. And if the discretion on this metric was not recorded in the minutes, we're left asking the question whether that's because members of the Remuneration Committee knew that they didn't have the sign-off of Sir Williams in the inquiry, but decided to use their discretion to just ignore that point and look at whether the performance of Post Office more generally had been okay and therefore awarded the bonus. Was there any evidence of that?
No, there was absolutely no evidence of that. I have found absolutely no evidence of anyone trying to mislead anyone or any dishonesty.